Welcome to Echoes of My Imagination. My name is Tracy Lee. Sit back, relax. Let me tell you a story. Today's story is part 3 of The Lost Currents of Atlantis and Mu, written by Tracy Lee T. Thompson. In the ancient long noon of Earth, Mu lived in quiet harmony with the planet's living pulse, until the builders of Atlantis, guided by the mysterious architects, severed that current and set their great stone empire on the slow path to ruin. Let's get into it. Chapter 11. The mud of Mu no longer reached their feet. The Atlanteans had come to the edge of the Pacific basin, carrying tools of stone, crystal, and metal instead of open palms and porous skin. Where once they had walked barefoot through warm, mineral-rich pools, feeling the slow heartbeat of the planet rise through their bodies, they now wore layers of metallic fabric. Gold threads glinted under the violet light of the atmosphere, copper wires snaked along sleeves, and the smell of heated alloys replaced the earthy, wet scent of Mu. For the first time, the pulse of the earth did not course naturally through them. They had stopped traveling to Mu's soft valleys, had begun to replicate the mud pools in their stone laboratories. These artificial reservoirs were precise, calculated, and cold. The water churned mechanically, mineral concentration exact, temperature consistent. But there was no flow of life, no whisper, no pulse. The first desync was not dramatic. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. A young Atlantean, a woman with ice-blue eyes, bent over a pool, her fingers tracing the water's edge. She hummed the old tuning, a frequency taught in Mu, but the water answered stiffly, its vibrations trapped within the crystal-lined walls. "It is wrong," she whispered. The sound seemed swallowed by the stone. Others noticed it too. The skin of their feet no longer tingled when they walked on the floors. Their bones, no longer nourished by the earth feed, grew heavier, denser. They had severed the natural circuit. The pulse had become optional, a resource to be captured, redirected, and stored. The architects watched from their towers, unseen but felt, their influence stretching like shadowed wires across the city. "Do not return," one voice commanded, though no mouth moved. "This is the moment you step into control. The Earth is a system. You will become its architects, its masters." And so the Atlanteans embraced it. They learned to mimic Mu, not to inhabit it. They pumped air with artificial currents, structured water into spiraling canals, and built stone pools that glowed with stored energy. They learned to hum in unison, to align crystals and metals to frequencies that no living hand could create naturally. They were the first civilization to operate entirely on the mechanics of vibration, the rules of geometry, and the cold logic of control. Yet humor lingered in small gestures. One Atlantean, tasked with lifting a massive quartz block, tapped a tuning rod and muttered, "Imagine telling Mu this is a game of chess." Others laughed quietly, though their feet felt nothing, and their skin sensed no pulse. The joke was half nostalgia, half defiance. A tiny rebellion in a city that measured everything in resonance and weight. The consequences were immediate, even if unseen. Rivers around the city faltered in their natural course. The lowlands of Mu, now unattended, began to stagnate in places. The soft currents of mineral water slowed. The violet breath no longer pulsed freely. Instead, it circulated through Atlantean towers and crystal batteries, harvested and concentrated. Life in Mu's basin became wilder, more independent, yet also fragile. This was the true cost of the first desync, the severing of a civilization from its life source, the first step toward what the architects had intended. Humans could no longer feel the earth as a living body. Their creations would last, their cities would shine, but the natural pulse would fade, its voice captured in stone, in crystal, and in the strict geometry of their engineered world. And somewhere in the distance, the ethereal mariners of the deep trenches twitched their bioluminescent eyes, sensing the change. The leviathans stirred. Even the living cables, the glass reefs, carried the news along the ocean's ley lines. Mew's song was not yet silenced, but it had been muted, measured, and reshaped. The Atlanteans, unaware of the betrayal in the currents, smiled and continued their work. They were builders now, masters of structure, and unknowingly, the first true engineers of a world divided, the living pulse and the copied, controlled hum. Chapter 12. The Atlanteans had severed their connection to Mew, but they did not realize they had left a vacancy. Into that space stepped the architects, the false gods. They were taller than Atlanteans, more fluid in form, and their presence carried an unsettling shimmer, like heat rising from obsidian. Where Atlanteans were solid state, heavy and precise, the architects were adaptive, sinewy, and endlessly curious. Their skin caught the violet light and fractured it, making them appear almost translucent, though their eyes were opaque, deep, and calculating. They did not arrive as invaders, not at first. They came as emissaries, builders, and teachers. They studied the grids of Atlantis, the crystal towers, the ley-wired canals, and the tuned stone. They laughed softly at minor miscalculations, subtly adjusting the resonances, leaving suggestions that seemed helpful. The Atlanteans, proud and focused, welcomed them. After all, who could fault perfection? But the architects carried a different pulse, one that did not harmonize, it manipulated. They discovered how to tune the captured energies of the Atlantean batteries, how to bend the stored violet breath and mineral currents to their will. They built devices that hummed with subtle dissonance, forcing the Atlanteans to follow new, invisible rhythms. These rhythms were not natural. They were control patterns designed to weaken the intuitive, flowing understanding that Mew's descendants had once possessed. In the early days, the changes were small. A crystal that had once vibrated freely now pulsed in restrained intervals. Water spun in spirals, but the spirals followed a pattern dictated by carved glyphs, not the natural cadence of flow. Atlanteans noticed the difference, but they attributed it to refinement, to efficiency. They did not see the subtle theft, the slow rewiring of the planetary pulse. The first harvest occurred quietly. Children born in the Atlantean cities were different from those in Mew. Their bodies were heavier, denser, and insulated from the currents that had nourished Mew's children. Their eyes lacked the soft, responsive glow of Lemurian pupils. They saw the world in angles, grids, and measurable frequencies. The architects observed with interest. They recorded which energies were strongest, which humans adapted fastest, and which ones resisted the forced solid-state nature. Atlantean laborers, masons, tuners, and navigators became the instruments of the harvest. The architects guided the building of the first isolators, stone chambers that cut the human body off from the earth feed entirely. Inside these chambers, children were grown in synthetic waters, electrically charged and chemically controlled, and the natural intuition, the soft pulse, the empathy of resonance was lost. These were the first humans who could operate independently of the planetary heartbeat. They were the first true servants of the architect's design. Meanwhile, the architects expanded. They moved to Egypt, to the Nile, carrying with them the lessons they learned from Atlantis. The pyramids were not monuments to gods. They were functional instruments, structured to capture, store, and manipulate energy. Each stone, each alignment with the stars, each hidden chamber, everything had a purpose in the same way Atlantean towers had. The Egyptians inherited the tools and the knowledge, but not the pulse. They were walking the line between civilization and system, between life and engineered energy. Through this slow infiltration, the architects solidified their place as beings to be revered. They did not demand worship at first. They inspired it by shaping the world, by bending energy, water, and stone in ways humans could not resist. Their cities shone, their waters flowed in perfect spirals, and their voices hummed with the resonance of controlled power. Yet all the while, Mu still whispered. Deep in the Pacific basin, the Lemurians' mud pools continued to pulse. The Atharo mariners swam through glowing reefs that carried currents of pure, undisturbed energy. The Leviathans breached the surface, discharging stored currents into the thick, violet air. The architects could manipulate the human networks, but the earth itself remembered, and it waited. And in the heart of the Atlantean capital, where the great crystal bridges connected three massive rings of stone and water, a single Atlantean paused. She placed her hands on the memory stones and hummed a tone not used in years, a frequency of Mu. The crystal flickered, a soft light rippling through its lattice. For a moment, the pulse remembered itself, and the architect's control quivered just slightly, like a shadow disturbed by wind. The game had only begun. Atlantis was the first stage. The world would change again and again, always guided, always measured, always harvested. But the earth's memory remained, waiting for those who could still listen. Chapter 13. The Nile moved slowly under a wide sky. Its water carried a thick scent of wet clay, reeds, and mineral silt drawn from far inland. Each flood spread dark soil across the valley, and when the waters withdrew, the land gleamed black and fertile beneath the sun. Atlantean ships arrived quietly. They were long vessels with smooth hulls that caught the light like dull silver. No sails hung from their frames. Instead, a faint hum moved through their metal ribs, a controlled vibration that pushed the ships along the river as steadily as a drifting leaf. The villagers who watched from the banks did not understand the sound, but they felt it in their feet when the vessels passed. The Atlanteans stepped onto the shore carrying rods, measuring frames, and crystalline tools wrapped in woven cloth. Their movements were calm and deliberate. They studied the riverbanks, the rise of the land, the path of the stars above the desert horizon. They were searching for something the architects had promised them, the pulse. Not the living current that had once flowed freely through Mu. That world was fading into quiet distance. What the Atlanteans sought now was a place where the earth's energy still moved clearly through stone and water, a location where the pulse could be captured again. The Nile Valley answered them. Beneath the soil ran deep mineral layers. Granite ridges slept below the sand, carrying faint electrical tension through their crystalline veins. The river itself moved in slow spirals as it curved through the basin, distributing mineral charge across the land each season. When the Atlanteans walked across the floodplain, their instruments began to hum. One of them knelt in the mud and pressed a small quartz rod into the soil. The crystal vibrated against his palm. He smiled. "This river remembers," he said quietly. They began to build. At first, the work looked simple. Markers were placed across the desert plateau west of the river. Lines were drawn across the ground using cords stretched between bronze stakes. Measurements repeated again and again until the angles were exact. Villagers watched from a distance. The builders worked without shouting. They did not rush. Every stone was tested, tapped, measured, then moved. Movement of the stones surprised everyone. Massive limestone blocks rose slowly from the quarry floor. Groups of Atlantean technicians surrounded each block holding wide, conical horns made of gold-copper alloy. When they blew into the horns, the air deepened into a low vibration that rolled across the ground like distant thunder. The stone trembled. Dust shook loose. Then the block lifted. Only a few inches at first, just enough that sunlight appeared beneath its base. The workers guided it gently along dark tracks laid across the sand, magnetite strips placed carefully along the route. A technician walked beside the floating block, carrying a slender rod. Each light tap adjusted its direction. The villagers stared with wide eyes. The Atlanteans did not celebrate the moment. For them, this was routine. Stone moved. Geometry held. Work continued. The structure that rose from the desert did not resemble the towers of Atlantis. It was simpler, heavier. Its sides climbed in 4 clean faces that met at a single point, high above the sand. The pyramid. Day after day the shape grew. Stone after stone slid into position with quiet precision. When each block settled, the sound of horns faded slowly until gravity returned and the stone lowered into place without impact. Inside the structure, chambers formed. Granite walls met at tight angles. Long passageways angled toward the northern sky. Narrow shafts pierced the stone and opened to distant stars. The builders worked mostly in silence, but sometimes a quiet laugh traveled through the chamber halls when a block settled perfectly on the first attempt. One worker tapped a rod against the wall and nodded. "Not bad for a copy," he said. The others understood the joke. This was a copy. The pyramid was not alive like Mu had been. It was not a breathing city like Atlantis once was. It was an attempt to recreate the pulse inside stone. Deep in the central chamber, the Atlanteans placed a large crystal core, quartz, clear as frozen water, taller than a man. Copper channels ran along the floor and walls, linking the crystal to the granite blocks surrounding it. When the system was complete, the builders gathered in the chamber. The horns sounded again. A long, steady tone filled the stone halls. The quartz core began to glow faintly. Vibrations traveled outward through the granite casing, down into the bedrock, and into the desert floor. Outside, the air shimmered. The river continued to move beside the valley, unaware of the experiment taking place on the plateau. The Atlanteans waited. For a moment, something answered. A faint resonance traveled back through the stone, a whisper of energy moving through the crystal lattice. But it was weak. The pulse did not return. The pyramid could capture energy. It could hold vibration. It could store power within its stone geometry. But the living current that once flowed through Mu could not be forced into obedience. The builders understood this immediately. None of them spoke for several minutes. Finally, one of the older technicians rested his hand on the granite wall and exhaled slowly. "We can imitate the river," he said, "but we cannot become it." Across the chamber, one of the architects watched from the shadow of the entrance corridor. The tall figure stood perfectly still, observing the experiment with calm interest. The pyramid had not restored the pulse, but it had done something else. It had created a machine capable of storing enormous energy. The architect's narrow eyes reflected the faint glow of the crystal core. This was useful, very useful. Outside, the Nile continued to flood and retreat exactly as it always had. The villagers returned to their fields. Reeds rustled along the riverbank. Fish broke the water's surface. The land still remembered the old world. But the structures rising from the desert belonged to something new, something colder, something patient. And far away across the ocean, beneath the fading skies of Mu, the quiet mud pools still pulsed softly beneath the surface of the earth. The planet had not forgotten. Not yet. Chapter 14. Atlantis did not fall in a single day. From the outside, the cities still looked perfect. Crystal bridges spanned the rings of stone. Water still moved through spiraling canals that reflected the violet glow of the atmosphere. The great towers still hummed with captured energy, their quartz cores shining like frozen lightning. But something inside the system had begun to drift. The first signs were small. Engineers noticed that the tones used to lift stone required slight adjustments. Frequencies that had once matched the resonance of the earth now needed correction. The horn still worked. The stones still floated. But the sound was never quite the same twice. The earth was no longer answering cleanly. In the central districts of the Atlantean capital, the great quartz libraries still held their records. Tall crystals stood in quiet halls, their surfaces smooth and translucent. Engineers and historians approached them as they always had. Hands rested against the facets. A low humming tone filled the chamber. Images poured through their nervous systems. Cities, maps, designs. The long history of their people stored in layers of light inside the crystal lattice. But recently, the stones had begun to hesitate. Sometimes the information arrived blurred, like a signal crossing through rough water. Other times the images arrived perfectly clear, but carried a faint distortion, angles slightly wrong, structures vibrating at frequencies that no longer matched the planet. One archivist removed his hands from a crystal and frowned. "The ground has changed," he said. Across the chamber, another technician nodded slowly. "We changed it." The towers continued drawing power from deep beneath the crust. Lay paths still carried magnetite currents through the cities, but every system depended on balance, and balance had been replaced with extraction. Energy moved in one direction now, up. The architects had perfected this design. Their structures were scattered quietly across the world. Deserts, mountains, river basins, hidden valleys. Each one connected through long geometric alignments that crossed oceans and continents. From above, the network formed an enormous pattern across the planet's surface. A grid. The Atlanteans had built most of it without realizing the full design. They believed they were strengthening civilization. They believed they were preserving the pulse. The architects knew they were redirecting it. Across the Pacific basin, Mu continued to breathe. The mud pools still shimmered under warm rain. Thick clouds drifted slowly across the basin's sky. Lemurians moved through the mineral waters as they had for hundreds of thousands of years, but the rhythm had weakened. The great living circuits that once connected ocean trenches, sky layers, forests, and deep crust had grown thin. The glass reefs of the deep sea flickered faintly. Leviathans surfaced less often, their massive bodies storing less energy than before. Even the atmospheric weavers in the high canopy felt the strain. Floating islands shifted unevenly in the charged sky. Storm systems lingered too long in some regions, while others grew strangely quiet. The earth was adjusting. Every system in nature responds to imbalance eventually. The Lemurians sensed it clearly. They stood waist deep in mineral pools, eyes half closed, feeling the slow drag inside the planetary rhythm. The pulse that once moved through them like steady breath now arrived in uneven waves. One elder lifted his hand from the mud and watched the water drip slowly from his fingers. "The world is tightening," he said. No one argued. Far away in Atlantis, the effects grew stronger. One evening, a lifting operation stalled along a major construction path. A stone block hung motionless above the ground while the levitators continued sounding their horns. Nothing happened. The lead engineer lowered his instrument and listened carefully. The air carried the tone correctly, but the ground beneath the stone remained stubbornly heavy. Gravity had returned. The team adjusted their pitch again. The horns deepened. The block trembled, lifted briefly, then slammed back to the surface with a dull thud that echoed across the quarry. Silence followed. One of the younger workers scratched the back of his head. "That never used to happen." No one laughed. In the great council halls of Atlantis, discussion turned tense for the first time in centuries. Guild leaders argued quietly over measurements, readings, and shifting frequencies. Charts filled with new data covered the stone tables. Every calculation pointed to the same conclusion. The earth itself was changing, or perhaps reacting. Few Atlanteans spoke openly about the architects during these discussions. Their presence had become so common, their advice so routine, that questioning them felt unnecessary. But a handful of engineers had begun noticing something unsettling. Every new adjustment recommended by the architects required more energy. Every solution strengthened the grid, and every strengthening of the grid weakened the natural response of the earth. One engineer finally spoke the thought others avoided. "We are forcing the system." Across the chamber, several heads lifted. For a moment, no one answered. Outside the council halls, the towers of Atlantis continued to glow. Ships still moved across the sea without sails. Crystal bridges still shone over the canals. To any traveler arriving from afar, the civilization looked unbreakable. But deep beneath the crust, enormous pressure had begun to build along the ridges of the ocean floor. The Earth's pulse was not gone. It was gathering, waiting. And far above the deserts of Egypt, the pyramids stood silent beneath the stars, their stone faces holding energy inside geometries that neither the Atlanteans nor the architects fully controlled. The planet was remembering something older than both civilizations, something patient. Something powerful enough to reset the currents of the world. The quiet breaking had begun. And that's it for today. Thank you for joining me for Echoes of My Imagination. My name is Tracy Lee. Don't forget to subscribe, share, like, and follow. And join me next time for part 4 of The Lost Currents of Atlantis and Mu.